Yes, ma'am.
Now?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, my name is Hazele William Payne, and the Hazel is spelled with an E, E-L-E. And I was born in Des Moines, Iowa, February 16th, 1891.
When did you come to Fairhope?
I came to Fairhope when I was about 9 or 10, I believe. I was here at the turn of the century, I already know that. In the 1900s, it must have been about 1899 that I came. 1998, 99. And I've lived here most of my life, except when I was around 17. I went to California for 3 years to high school. My mother remarried, and I went out there with her and lived in Los Angeles. Went to high school for 3 years out there. The rest of my time I've spent in Fairhope.
How did you come to Fairhope? How did you travel down here when you came?
My grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfonso Swift, had a place here in Fairhope. They had a big strip of land from the bay clear through to Section Street. It was a Spanish grant, and they lived here. And so my mother and father separated, and my mother brought me here to my grandparents while she went back to Des Moines and went to work. And consequently, I stayed here until I was about, 19. The California earthquake was in 1906, and I went to California a year or two later with my mother and lived out there for 3 years. And then when she passed on, I came back to my grandparents and lived with them and went to the organic school. Not the organic. Yeah, wait a minute. Yeah, I went to organic school because Mrs. Johnson was a personal friend of the family's. And I went to her school. I'd gone to high school in California, and I was ready to graduate down here. And when I was out there, they put me back in sophomore year. So when I was ready to graduate, I had 1.5 year to finish, came back to Fairhope. I'd gone to high school then 6.5 years and still hadn't graduated. And Mrs. Johnson said, I think you've had enough schooling. She said, I'll give you a diploma and put you in teacher's training. And I took teacher's training under her for 2 years, and then I taught under her for about 3 until I was married.
Let me stop and move that umbrella so we can get her out of the sun, okay?
Okay, we're going to put an umbrella.
I'm on.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the town of Fairhope looked like when you first came here? What was it? It was a small community.
Well, our only transportation in Fairhope then was by boat from here to Mobile, and the streets were all mud streets. They were not paved, and there was a big grocery store that carried everything from lace to harnesses, and fertilizer and everything, called Mershon Brothers. And it was a huge mercantile store. And once a week, my grandmother would send me up to the store with a little red wagon to get a week's supply. There was no groceries and things, and I'd take them home. We lived on the bay front. My grandfather had a strip of land from the bay clear through to Section Street, known as the Spanish Grant. And we lived on the bay front. And we'd get our groceries about once a week or twice a week, and I'd bring them home in my little red wagon.
When did Mrs. Johnson come to Fairhope? Do you remember that? When she came to Fairhope?
I was trying to think.
Okay.
1906. It was in the early 1900s, but I couldn't tell you just when.
Did she live with your grandfather then, when she first came to Fairhope?
No, Mrs. Johnson taught school in Manitoba, Minnesota. Maybe they've told you this. And she was from Manitoba, Minnesota, and she was a school teacher up there. And she was objecting to the public school education. And progressive education at that time was just coming into progress, you might say, coming into view, into prominence. And Mr. Johnson, he was a tall, handsome Swede, and he didn't like the winters up there. He wanted to come south. Well, Mrs. Johnson heard of the Fairhope and the things like that, and she decided that they'd come south. And she went to a dentist in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the dentist was my aunt, Mrs. Ella Getty, and through her she learned of Fairhope. And so they came here, and when they came here, Mr. Johnson went on to Mississippi, where he had located a pecan farm, and Mrs. Johnson came to Fairhope and lived with my grandmother and my grandfather and myself all one winter in Fairhope. And the public school at that time had an opening for a public school teacher. And the public school at that time was very small, probably about, maybe 30 or 40 students, and they only went from the 1st to the 8th grade. And one teacher handled a whole bunch. So Mrs. Johnson decided she'd take that for 1 year while Mr. Johnson was in Mississippi looking after the pecan orchard, and she lived with us. And she had a little boy about 2 or 3 years old, Clifford Ernest, and my grandmother took care of the little boy in the daytime while Mrs. Johnson taught public school.
Did she try any of her progressive education techniques at that public
Not
school?
then. She was still studying. She would study at nights on her progressive education. And Frabel and Henderson and Oppenheim and John Dewey were 4 big progressive education people at that time, and were pushing progressive education, especially John Dewey. And they all at one time visited Fairhope when she got her school down there finally, and we all met them and talked with them and everything. She would study those things at night. They might say they were almost her Bible. At night she would go up to her bedroom in the Swift house, which was a big house on the bay front, and she put the little boy to bed, and he wouldn't stay. He'd get up all the time, so she'd have to call down to my grandmother to come up and put him to bed. Grandmother would put him down and tell him to go to sleep, and he'd turn over and go to sleep for her, but he wouldn't do it for his mother. And so while he was in bed, she studied these 4 progressive education books. They seemed to be almost her Bible. She was so imbued with it. Well, when Mr. Johnson got the farm located in Mississippi, she taught public school 1 year, and then she went to the farm where he was to be with him, and it was quite a place near Meridian, Mississippi. And she was up there, I don't know whether it was 2 or 3 years or 4 years, but while she was there, a second son was born, little Franken, to her. And one summer, my grandmother and grandfather and myself, we all went up to see her at Meridian. And at that time, the pecan orchards, they're always full of these big nests of worms. And nowadays they spray, you don't have to have them anymore. But those days they didn't have spray, and the only way to get rid of them was to take a long stick with a rag with kerosene and soak it and burn them, just burn them out. Run them up like a fishbowl in the trees and burn them out. So my grandfather went up there, and we stayed 2 weeks with him, and he helped Mr. Johnson go through his orchard and burn out the pecan, the worms, all the caterpillars, all the pecan trees.
Can you tell me what is the essence of the progressive education? You talk about progressive education. How would you describe what progressive education is?
I would describe it as children of all one age being together, regardless of their ability to learn or not learn. That's why her classes must be small. You take all 9-year-olds and put them together. Socially, a 9-year-old should be all alike. Academically, he probably is not.